It's really an honor to sit down with Larry Grant, Scott Steedman, and Lindsay Gibson. So for the next hour or so, we're going to reflect on what happens when we peel back historical layers in public spaces and institutions with a decolonial lens. Over the past 15 years here in Vancouver, each of us have witnessed several firsts in the city in terms of public naming processes and acts of reconciliation with the Musqueam Nation. The Hunkaminam language remains critically endangered, and there are no remaining fluent first language speakers in the community. This work began prior to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2013, and actually the first buildings to be gifted names, or the first public institution to be gifted names by Musqueam, was the University of British Columbia through the Student Housing and Hospitality Services Department. This has resulted in a series of dormitory buildings that now carry Hunkaminam names, and with them, much needed Musqueam teachings and history. More broadly, in September 2021, the City of Vancouver made a motion to remove colonial names tied to racist history in the city. At this time, Musqueam gifted the city a new name for the 16-block Kitsilano Street, called SʔəyəЛəq Awesome, meaning Musqueam View Street. It took 4 more years before City Council officially enacted and implemented this bylaw amendment, officially renaming Trutch Street to SʔəyəLəq Awesome Street just last June in 2025. So Larry, we'll begin with you. What does it mean to you as a knowledge keeper, but also to your nation, to have Hunkaminam name used and restored in these territories?
The renaming of Trutch Street was very significant in the history of Musqueam and other nations because of the kind of a person that Trutch was, very, very prejudiced and racist against First Nations and any other people of color. And to be able to take that name and push it aside was really, really important for our community, for the well-being and understanding that we as a nation, as a people, were finally given credence and relevance to the city of Vancouver that is part of our homelands, our ancestral homelands. And we are still here. And that is such a significant thing to have our language written in the orthography that is meaningful to us, that actually represents the different sounds of different languages that the Latin alphabet cannot do. It's not set up to represent the different sounds of all the different languages of the world. And for us to be able to say, because of truth and reconciliation and because of UNREP, that we have a right to have our language represented and spelled and shown in the way that we think is correct for ourselves, and not to be overrun by the different policies of language that they demand that we write it in the Latin alphabet. We do have streets in the city that are on the reserve, actually, our streets in Musqueam is one of the only Native communities in North America that every street is written and in our language of Huncamino. And that's very, very significant. However, I understand some people take umbrage to it and want to have it written in the Latin alphabet. But if you take a look in the Musqueam Reserve and have a look at all the names that are there, the street I live on is Humlisum, and it's Humlusum is how it's spelled, but the actual word is Humlisum. And coming off from Marine Drive from UBC direction, the turnoff street is Tamith, and it's actually Tumith. The actual word is Tumith, red ochre. And then we have the other streets that are Tsleil-Waututh. And that's an actual historical name, ancestral name. And when you read it and when people have read it, they say, oh, Tsleil-Waututh. No, it's not Tsleil-Waututh, it's Tsleil-Waututh. So that's something that I understand because I went to school at Strathcona in the 1940s. And who says what? Who says what? Which? Where? Why? That's all North Americanized. We have the which that we burn is also the which, asking the question, which one? And what is the meaning of that? No one speaks like that anymore. So if we use the Latin alphabet with those letters that actually had a real significant meaning originally in the English language, which is no longer recognized. All the watts are the same, the watts of the lights and the watts of Scotland. And Canada Post machines are not set up for the North American phonetic alphabet, which is what we use, the NAPA. In linguistic circles, they call NAPA. And that's a derivative of the International Phonetic Alphabet, the IPA. And that is developed by English-speaking people to represent the sounds of different languages or different languages around the world. But the NAPA is not what we call it's not a tight representation of linguistics. The diacritics are not all used in the NAPA. That's a very loose interpretation of sound, which actually serves the North American languages, indigenous languages, very well, though. So the machines in the Canada Post are not set up. The orthography is not set up in the BC statistics. So that's the problem that we have right now. And at the moment, because of the resistance and the cry to erase DRIPA from British Columbia law, that they have stopped working on trying to change the orthography to the NAFA to the point where it would be accepted. And the challenging part with British Columbia too, there's over 62 languages in North America, and 32 to 35 are the languages that are spoken here in British Columbia. And all the different language recorders use a different system, but the Coast Salish, the Central Coast Salish languages, like the Stalo, is Hulkamelam, Musqueam is Hunkaminam, and on Vancouver Island on the east coast is Hulkaminam. And it's pretty well one language, and there are many dialects out of it that we have sounds that other languages in British Columbia do not have. We're very, very distinctive sounds in Hunkaminam or Hulkamelam or Hulkaminam that are not sounded in the other languages of British Columbia. There's 7 language families here in British Columbia, and all the rest are derivatives of those 7 languages. So,
Recent phenomenon for institutions in the city and province to begin using the traditional languages of these lands. But if you think back to 2010, when Musqueam first was invited to use place names or give place names to the university, what were some of the difficult conversations that came about, and what resistance did you encounter?
That's when we named Totem Park. Yeah, in 2010, the naming committee, under probably from pressure from our Musqueam UBC liaison person, Leona Sparrow, to correct the names of the different nations that were represented in Totem Park student housing, and that was all written in the Latin alphabet. And they agreed to allow us to name one building, and that was Humlesum, which is a transformation site story that's located on Wreck Beach, just off the top end of Wreck Beach. And we had quite a difficult time with that because there was a huge resistance coming from the naming committee at UBC. They didn't want a Hunkaminam name. They wanted to be able to write it in Latin alphabet. And they didn't see why it had to be corrected anyways. It's been like that ever since UBC had Totem Park. And well, they're not respectful to the community, not respectful to the languages. And this is something that we should correct and have the proper spelling and the proper stories behind the names. And it took quite some time. they kind of dismissed us, Leona Sparrow and myself, and there was pressure that was continued by the student body that was helping us. And the two students that were on the committee were Sarah Ling and John Lindsay. Yeah. And after a couple of years, we got a message from UBC to come out and continue the conversation, and decided that they would give us that naming of that house. And we said, oh, we can name that? And they said, yeah. There was still resistance from the built-in systemic racism and the policies that govern Canada and UBC and the province of British Columbia. But we name it Kalachan. Kalachan is where the fortified site that's down there on the beach where Creekside, the warrior families lived there. That's the name we gave it, Kalachan, as the fortified, as the fort. And then a couple of years later, we were asked to do another one. And it was going to be the last building on Totem Park. And it was at the top end of Totem Park. And given that our names on the reserve are all different sites that are meaningful to Musqueam, and we said, okay, that's at the top end. We'll name it Tsleil-Waututh. Tsleil-Waututh. And that's the trading village that's in Marpole, Tsleil-Waututh. So when we had our artists do a mural for that, representing Musqueam, and it's the two-headed serpent, which is very, very significant representation of the origins of the name of Musqueam. So we got that, and it was quite significant. It was a different president at the time. So, but there was still a lot of resistance, because when they were going to rename Ponderosa Commons, the naming committee called us up, and we got there, and all these suits came into the room talking about, can you name it? You got a word for oak, you got a word for pine, you got a word for fir, you got a word for a couple of other things I can't remember right now. I said, yeah, we can do that. And within a couple of days, they just called us up again and said, no, we're not going to name it in that. We're all going to name it in English. Like, we don't need you guys. So there's quite a bit of resistance at that time. And that was just before the TRC and UNGIP came out. So that's been quite a challenge. So, but it's good to see the names there. It represents Musqueam, the territory, the First Peoples of the territory, and represents our languages. And that's really, and it represents our stories. Everyone has a story. Every name has a story to it, and very significant to the community. So what we did at that time. So hopefully it carries on.
I thought it was important to look back because we often see these, good feeling media stories about reconciliation between our host nations and government or institutions. But there's often, as I've witnessed Elder Grant and other leaders from Musqueam over the years, there's often a struggle, and a struggle that isn't vocalized or surfaced. And it's sadly always an uphill battle, even when your own nation is actually giving these names to these institutions. So I still find it really, really disturbing. And things are slightly improving, I would say, over the past 15 years, but we still have a long way to go in terms of having people reconcile within themselves and within our institutions. Scott, you first met Larry, I believe, when you were interviewing him about Musqueam street signs on campus. And in writing Reconciling with Larry, I know he's spoken a lot about the evolving relationship with UBC. Did you have any thoughts on perhaps how that is changing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a historian and I'm talking to a whole room full of historians, so I'm loath to hold forth about the history of UBC, but I don't know if you guys probably know, it was created in 1908 by an act of the BC legislature. They basically said, sorry, we can't give you any money, but instead we're going to give you most of Point Grey, and you can do with it whatever you want. 1,200 and something hectares of land. And I've never got to the bottom of more than half of it ended up being created and turned into a park. But the original plan was actually to subdivide all of Point Grey and make a shitload of money to fund the university. And they've pretty much done that anyway. And I think something like 250 something hectares have been subdivided or in other ways rented, or they're the main source of UBC's endowment. That's where most of its money comes from.
Now, Lindsay, you've done a wider survey in terms of how schools have been named in Vancouver from 1886 to just in 2023. And I know you've also presented your study in more public settings, such as through the Vancouver Historical Society. What were some of the key findings that you found, and what has your experience been like in discussing naming and renaming in a public setting?
Yeah. Thanks. It's a real honor to be here and be on a panel with Larry and Scott. And thanks for inviting me, Sarah. I got really interested in school names. So my job is I teach teachers who are becoming social studies and history teachers at UBC, and also master's and PhD students. And my research is in history education, but I also I work in history education, but I've also written about the history of history education, if that's confusing. And I also try and do some history at the same time period. So I got really interested in school naming in Vancouver because the neighborhood I live in, South Granville, sort of Fairview, right on the border there was a controversy a few years ago about L'École by Ling. And they had taken, its original name was the Cecil Rhodes Elementary. Okay, and I don't know if anyone knows Cecil Rhodes. Interestingly enough, there are 3 other schools. Winnipeg just renamed a school that was also named after Cecil Rhodes. There was also a Cecil Rhodes in London, Ontario. And so what they had done is when they rebuilt L'École by Ling, they had and tore down the original Cecil Rhodes. It was renamed L'École by Ling, I think, in 1970 or 71. They cut out the tiles at the entrance of the school, and they put it into storage, and they rebuilt the new school. And then they decided, when they built the new school, on the playground to mount the old tiles on the playground. And Jennifer Reddy, Vancouver School Board counselor, the Roads Must Fall movement was happening at this exact same moment when this was put on the ground. And people are saying, what are you doing? Like, do you know who Cecil Rhodes is? Like, why would you want to honor this person on this playground? And so I lived in this neighborhood and I was really into the controversy. And so then it really got me thinking, like, well, how did these schools in Vancouver actually get named? And what's this process? So along with a graduate student, Mallory Davis, we embarked on a 2 or 3 year program to sort of chart and understand school naming in Vancouver. And I'm from the Okanagan, from Kelowna, and so I'd done my undergrad at SFU. I did my PhD at UBC, but this was a really great introduction to the history of this place, of the city, because the school naming patterns over time are really a story of this place. And so what we noticed was that Vancouver for a long time was a series of different municipalities. You had Vancouver, you had the district of South Vancouver. In 1908, it separated. Point Grey seceded from South Vancouver and created its own. Every single one of these places had their own naming patterns, right? And so what we noticed over time, I'm happy to share the article and other things that I never read my stuff, so I actually read it last night. I was like, oh, wow, I wrote that a few years ago. I forgot about all of that. But basically what we did is we periodized by region, but also over time, what the different patterns were. And basically there's been 189, I think that's off the top of my head, school names over time. Only 57 schools were never renamed. Right? So there's been a massive process of renaming over time for a whole bunch of different reasons. Sometimes it was because the school changed its purpose or function from central school to becoming an art school or something like that, but sometimes because of controversies and other things. But what we notice over time is that in Vancouver, for example, the school naming pattern was basically in the early days, everything was around geographic names. So the East School, these other things. And it was really, Vancouver was such a new city, it was almost like they named them to teach people about the geography of this place, right? Mount Pleasant School, False Creek School, East School, West School, all of these ideas. Then beginning in about 1900, all of these Vancouver school names became very imperial. So you had things like Lord Roberts, Lord Nelson, Lord Strathcona, Lord Tennyson, all of these, General Gordon of Khartoum, like all of these different names over time, they were Cecil Rhodes, they were these really imperial figures. Then in South Vancouver, strangely enough, there was a contest that they did. They were also geographic named until about the early 1900s. And then they had a contest and they said, they asked the schools and several school board counselors said, we will give you money to the students who nominate people to name schools after. So one school said, let's name them after heroes of Canadian history. And they said, you're the winner. So then we got General Brock, General Wolfe, Tecumseh, James Douglas. I mean, the list goes on and on. Van Horn, right? The list goes on and on of these great Vancouver people. Point Grey, which secedes in 1908, they had a naming pattern. They said, well, what should we name our schools after? They named them after all these people because the First World War was happening, right? Lord Kitchener, Lord Byng, Edith Cavell, right? If you know, Edith Cavell was a nurse during World War I who was captured and killed by the Germans for espionage. So you had all of these like World War I names. And then after amalgamation in 1928, they kind of continued the naming patterns. And then in the 50s, they said, we're naming too many people after British people who have no connection to this area. So they started naming them after local people. School board superintendents, McCorkindale, Dr. George Weir, education, deans of education at UBC, Cunningham Elementary, who was the creator of Shoppers Drug Mart. So more local kind of names. And then not until, late 2020s do they really begin naming and consulting with the Musqueam Nation to start naming and giving place-based names or other ideas. But the grand story is, I guess, overall is commemorations are about power, right? Who has the power to name things, right? Gene Barman wrote a great article in 2007 called Erasing Indigenous Indigeneity in Vancouver. So one of the things that I do with my students when they first come in the first day, we talk about land acknowledgements. And we say, and we look at names overall, and I show them the map of, I don't know if you've ever seen it, that it came from the August Jack Catalano and J.S. Matthews, and it says before the paleface came, and it's all of the indigenous naming of this place named Vancouver. And we see that there are 3-4 dozen names of this area that they all had names that existed before. And these places all got renamed, right? And part of the settler project in Canada is renaming things, right? There's stories about building the CPR, asking workers in the CPR, like, what's your mother's family village in Scotland? Okay, great, let's name this area, right? So this renaming process, I've been working on how the 1948, the Nakba, has been taught in Israeli school. I have an Israeli scholar that we've been writing about it. The renaming process of the Nakba was a big part of this, that when Palestinians were removed from villages, they renamed hundreds upon hundreds of villages. And the same thing was happening here in Vancouver, renaming areas, giving them settler names at the same time period. And so the long story short, Vancouver has more school names named after people than any other district in British Columbia. Of the schools named after people or named after streets named after people, there's only 14% of the schools are named after women. Not a single school in Vancouver is named after a person of color. Okay, now some people would say, well, James Douglas. Well, James Douglas never identified himself as being, we know that he had Black ancestry. What's that, sorry? Oh, sorry, I'm saying before 2022, I think, when Norma Rose Point was named. So also not a person of Chinese descent, not a person of South Asian descent, no names whatsoever of these particular schools. And, it's like Elizabeth Walker's book on street names in Vancouver, right? There's more names named after golf courses than there are after women, right? I mean, it's like, what is going on here? So the idea of, when I gave a speech at the Vancouver Historical Society, I asked people at the beginning and saying, how many of you think that schools should ever be renamed that are named after people that have been proven to be racist or done all of these things? And there was very few hands that went up. I said, I'm going to present to you the history of school naming and how schools were named, and I want you to ask you after whether you think that schools should be renamed again. And I asked at the very end, and very few hands also went up. So I wasn't very convincing overall of this naming pattern. But this idea that schools, like we said, only 57 schools in the history of Vancouver have never been renamed. It's a major problem. And so we've seen now that the Vancouver School Board has a new naming and renaming policy. They regularly consult with Musqueam. All of the new schools are place-based names, which I think is a step in the right direction. And they're not dual named. It's not translations, exactly as Elder Larry was saying. And so I think this is a really important step overall, but they've also experimented with renaming processes. So they did rename Matthew Begbie. They have a whole process now by which you can pitch why you think the school community can pitch why a school should be renamed. So they renamed Matthew Bailey Begbie Elementary to SʔəyəЛəq, right? A renaming process. Lord Roberts is scheduled to be renamed, but hasn't been given a name yet. I don't know. Lord Roberts down in the West End. David Lloyd George Elementary in Marpole is scheduled to be renamed and hasn't been renamed. So it's really slow. And so, what I would say about reconciliation is I would say to people that renaming is the low-hanging fruit of reconciliation. It's literally the easiest thing that you basically can do, and yet we see massive resistance on a regular basis. And this causes harm. Right? It causes harm that people are putting themselves out there to rename things and to get people to think about renaming. And it seems really easy. And then there's all of this contestation and people saying, well, I went to this school 40 years ago and I feel deeply connected to it and it should never be renamed. Right? And so we regularly talk to our students about the difference between commemoration and history. And now all commemorations have a history, but these are very different things. Anyways, I could talk for years about this, but I'll stop.
No, I love hearing you speak, Lindsay, so that's why I brought you. But you're totally right. It does so much harm when it seems so simple, right?
Right.
And I think we could survey this audience, and there might be some mixed reactions, but I'm curious to hear from Larry in terms of hearing about all of this ongoing cycle of resistance of colonial wrongs. It's hard not to become upset. Even it just triggers so many memories of really tough conversations we've had to have as people working in this field. Or for those of you who are on social media, there are endless barrage of just atrocious comments and pure racism on display. I know you talk about this a little bit in your book, but how do you process anger and bitterness?
I didn't want to be Chinese. Same thing. All the heroes are British or English or American, and they're all not people of color. And we were always pushed aside. First Nations were ignored. We weren't allowed to do anything. And the Chinese with the Exclusion Acts, the First Nations, have a multitude of acts that are exclusionary. Every one of them excludes us from something. And most of it's our identity, our culture, and the hurt that you carry, and the not wanting to be who you are. It's very, very destructive to a young mind. And I think I did a lot of vending on the waterfront as a longshoreman. That gave me the perfect venue to vent. A lot of questions that came from the immigrant population that worked on the waterfront. I could yell and scream and give different graphic examples of what I'm talking about in very, very plain street gutter language that opened the doors gradually with the guys that I spoke with. And I know people have asked me at UBC, the associate dean of art at that time, in the first 5-10 years that I was at UBC, said, "You never, ever sound angry. Why do you not sound angry?" I said, well, I learned something in my lifetime. In a room like this, being angry, being agitated is one thing, but to be angry, I would lose every one of you within seconds. And that's very different from being on the waterfront on a face-to-face, one-to-one. You can yell, you can scream, you can give very, very visual examples. And doing that here, I have to be able to speak to you and lay the cards on the table and explain to you in a very, very modified voice that this is the reason. It's like the presentations that you have in the courtroom, very civil, very respectful, and have it laid down. And you can take the odd cheap shot and still be respectful. And sometimes that really works, really, really works. A cheap shot here and there, that, it wakes up the mind of the listener. So, but I am hurt. I am bitter. I am angry. I've watched my cousins come home from Indian residential school and wonder, as a child, why are they behaving that way? And why are they acting like that? Why do they talk like that? It took me years to understand. They're just repeating the lessons they had learned from their primary caregiver. And the primary caregiver was the government and the churches. And today I don't have much respect for a lot of the people that have resistance to equality, and that's something I learned a long time ago. But as a young person, I could not be physical. I could be physical if I was interested in surviving a beating. As, my older brother was the physical one. He settled a lot of arguments physically. Myself, the only tools I had was my mouth and my brain. So I figured my uncle, as mother's younger brother, one day said, "You know your son, your second son? He doesn't get angry at me, but he reverses the roles and he makes me cry just with his words." So I learned a long time ago that I couldn't be physical and couldn't be just angry and yelling at someone all the time. I had to use the words and turn it, change the roles to the point where the other person actually begins to understand the meaning of anger and hurt and frustration and trauma. So that's basically what it is. So.
What I really appreciate, Larry, is that every time you share your story, you are also asking those that are listening to you to look inwards ourselves. And I think, Scott, you summed it up really beautifully, that reconciling is an ongoing, unfinished process, which all of us are going through, Indigenous and settler, immigrant and Canadian-born. Because Larry has been so vulnerable with us, I'm going to ask you, Scott and Lindsay, as we conclude, what are some ways that you are reconciling at this stage of your careers and your lives? And what's so great about that definition is that it doesn't really enable complacency, right? It doesn't allow us to, book a date where we're going to give a land acknowledgement and call it a day. It's asking us, what are we doing now? What are we doing tomorrow?
Well, working with Larry on this book has been a pretty incredible process for me because it's made me think about a lot of things that I just took for granted. Grew up in Vancouver. I'll give you one sort of mundane example. When I was, age 1965, my parents moved to Vancouver and they rented a house above Spanish Banks. And I've always lived near Spanish Banks. It's just, to me, a beautiful part of the world. It's always kind of stirred my emotion. And when I was talking to Larry at the beginning, he said, when I was a kid, it wasn't like that. It was all marshland. And there were ducks, and there were streams with salmon and trout in them. And it was totally different. And of course, my first reaction was, I don't believe him. And then I went home. Sorry to admit that, Larry. I went home and Googled it. And of course, it's totally true. 1929, the city of Vancouver took out a 100-year lease on that land, but it took them a while to do it. So, and it was like that. And the fascinating thing is, people think of it as a beautiful place, but if you go and have a look, it's like Stanley Park. It's totally artificial, right? There's a lot of the sand was brought in. They line up all the logs. People play volleyball. Then you've got grass. Then you've got parking lots. And that's what it is. But fascinatingly now, they're actually returning it in little bits to the way it used to be. There's a thing called Canyon Creek, which you can go and visit, and it's totally fake. It almost looks like the logs are made of plastic or something. Some of them are bolted down so they won't move. There's water there, but you can tell that the water is actually being pumped, like it's going up and down, because there's not enough water to actually make a Canyon Creek. But it's a beautiful little sort of pre-contact bit of Spanish Banks that's been reinvented at presumably enormous cost to us Vancouver taxpayers. I don't know how much it costs. Tatlow Creek, they've done the same thing. Anyway, that's actually all a bit of a tangent to say. Working with Larry, I think the fascinating thing about the reconciling process is that the best way, I think, for people like me who grew up in privilege, Scottish background, is to hear personal stories. And that's why I thought your presentation was so amazing, Catherine. I love your book, about the photo ones. I haven't seen your other book, but it's just that hearing Larry talk, and we've done more than 20 events together now, just humanizes this. People hear these abstract things about imperialism and colonialism and settler culture and blah, blah, blah. It's all very abstract. But to actually talk to someone like Larry, who talks so eloquently about all the injustice, the unfair practices that he had to live with, the fact that he should have been an engineer. He was a brilliant student. He couldn't become an engineer because Chinese people couldn't become engineers in British Columbia at that time. Like, how ridiculous is that? And that's not even the government. That's whoever it is, the governing body of engineers, who just doesn't register people of Chinese or Indigenous origin at the time. But I think the way that people will learn about reconciling, which is an ongoing process, is by hearing stories of like the ones that you tell, Catherine, and like Larry's story. And if I can just point out the book, it says the subtitle is A Lifelong Struggle to Belong. And really the reconciling that Larry's doing is with himself. Like he says at the beginning, he doesn't want to be Chinese, doesn't want to be Indigenous either a lot of the time. And it's only when he's in his 40s that he starts being like, I'm putting words in your mouth, Larry, but they're in the book. And there's another story. He went back to China when he was in, how old, 77? And that was a big part too, reconciling, when he went there and realized this is home. Maybe you should tell that story, Larry, not me.
Since we don't have time to get into it, you have to buy a copy of Reconciling. But it is true. I think those of us who are privileged to live and work in Vancouver, and we encounter Larry on a regular basis in this sector, we really only see a sliver of Larry's life. And I learned so much about him. And yeah, he's never been able to retire. So a lot of what we see Larry do today has only been in the past 30 years of his 89 years with us. Sorry to put you on the spot. But what's really powerful is there's a chapter in Reconciling where Larry talks about the transformational process of going home. And he asks all of us to go home, not to get off territory, but to actually look at where we come from. I know we're approaching the end of our time, so I'm going to ask Lindsay to answer.
Yeah, I'm going to slightly disagree with that definition, because reconciling I see as repairing and rebuilding relationships. And I personally don't see this as a job of Indigenous people that need to reconcile relationships with settlers. I think this is the work that we do. So as a history educator and social studies educator, I always live by this, this quote that, every quote that sounds pithy and smart gets attributed to Mark Twain. So I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but he says, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And so I really see my job as a history educator is we do a lot of, we're not only just teaching teachers how to teach, but how are they going to get their students, and how are they going to commit themselves to thinking differently about the history of this place? And that could be Vancouver, the province of British Columbia, Canada in general. And so I see this as, let's unpack these stories really deeply and think about how are we going to help students think differently about this place that we live. That, it's always been the way that this is. That sometimes when we challenge those and pull these back, that people think about them very differently. And so, in my family, my father was an RCMP officer. My mother was a nurse. My older brother was a social worker. I became an educator. Well, we're all in these so-called helping professions, but all of these professions have a terrible colonial history and cause enormous amounts of harm. So I see this as our job as, going back to the Murray Sinclair quote, education got us into this mess, and education's going to get us out of this mess. So what does truth look like? How do we help students think about the history of this place? And so part of that is asking questions about why are these things named the way they are? Why are these actions? Why, I, as a young kid in 1985, my dad was transferred to Burns Lake, British Columbia. Right? I was born in Smithers. Some people call Burns Lake the most racist town in British Columbia. Right? There's 2 reserves, 2 Daco communities bordering the town. And every day I would walk from my from my home about 2 kilometers to the public school in the center of the town. And I would walk every day through a school ground of a Catholic day school called Immaculata School, the Catholic school. And as I was walking through that school ground, the school buses would be arriving, and all the students that got off were First Nations, right? From the 2 local reserves that would go to this school. This is where John Furlong, if you know the story of John Furlong, was a teacher at one point at this particular school. They had the worst school fields. Their soccer nets were made out of rough timber. The basketball hoops had no hoops on them. They were all broken or whatever else. And I would walk through the school ground and go to public school. And in my public school, there was only, out of maybe 300 or 400 kids, there was 10 First Nations kids somewhere, right? And I remember thinking to myself, well, why is that? Who are these First Nations kids at this school? And in my mind as a young kid, it's like, they must be the best students and the best athletes or the best, saxophone players, and they were selected to go to this school. And only looking back on this and understanding history did I understand who those kids were. Those kids, up until 1985, the Indian Act, if a First Nations woman married a non-Indigenous person, automatically lost status, and automatically those kids were not allowed to would not go to that school. And so they had to go to the public school at the same time period, right? So I remind my students all the time is don't beat yourself up for what you don't know, but now that you know differently, how are you going to behave differently, right? And I think that's the really key thing for us to think about as settlers going forward.
Thank you so much, guys. This is really thought-provoking.
The reconciling, it's not just all of us. The reconciling is with me, each individual. I didn't want to be Chinese. I didn't want to be Native. I wanted to go to a university and be an engineer. I couldn't go. Why? To beat yourself up, the trauma that you have, and it's a challenge. It's like a drunk. He has to know he's a drunk first, that he's having problems with alcohol. Then he's got to accept it. Then what is he going to do with it? But it's every day, one day at a time. So there's no ending to it. And that's really what I understand about our using that word reconciling. It's for me to ensure that I look after myself every day and accept who I am and be proud of who I am and who and what I represent. So that's really what I wanted to say. Thank you.